What if the one thing everyone laughed at became the only thing that saved a farm from dying? When 21-year-old Emma Brooks sold her last tractor to buy 200 chickens, the entire town called her crazy. But after a devastating drought swept across Kansas, those same people came looking for answers. What they discovered wasn't just a smarter way to farm. It was the final lesson her grandfather had left behind, hidden in 7 simple words that would change countless lives forever. Late spring winds carried dry dust across the fading cornfields of Butler County, Kansas. Gray clouds drifted overhead without bringing rain, while cracked earth stretched endlessly beneath a weary sky that had forgotten what a good harvest looked like. Emma Brooks stood quietly beside the freshly covered grave of her grandfather, William Brooks, long after everyone else had gone home. At 21 years old, she looked younger than her age whenever she smiled, but there was no smile left that afternoon. She was 5'6" with a lean, athletic frame shaped by years of lifting feed sacks, repairing fences, and working beside her grandfather since childhood. Her chestnut brown hair, usually tied into a practical ponytail, had come loose in the relentless Kansas wind. A scattering of freckles crossed her fair cheeks, while her hazel eyes carried a mixture of determination and exhaustion that no young woman should have learned so early in life. Her rough hands, marked with small cuts and calluses, revealed a lifetime spent outdoors rather than behind a desk. Friends often described Emma as patient, thoughtful, and quietly stubborn. William used to joke that she had inherited both his kindness and his refusal to quit, a trait that sometimes made life harder but never made her regret doing what she believed was right. For more than 50 years, William Brooks had farmed the same land his father and grandfather had once cultivated. He believed every season deserved respect, even the difficult ones. As a little girl, Emma often rode beside him in the battered green tractor before sunrise. While other children learned stories from books, she learned them from weathered hands pointing toward the horizon, explaining how clouds, soil, birds, and insects all spoke their own language if someone cared enough to listen. But the land had changed. 3 consecutive years of drought had slowly stolen the life from the Brooks farm. Spring rains arrived too late. Summer heat lingered too long. Corn stalks grew shorter each season, while the soil beneath them hardened into something that resembled cracked pottery more than farmland. Fertilizer prices climbed. Diesel fuel doubled. Equipment repairs became impossible to afford. William borrowed money hoping one good harvest would restore everything. Yet every harvest only deepened the debt. When William passed away after a sudden heart attack, Emma inherited far more than the family farm. She inherited unpaid bank loans, overdue tax notices, collapsing fences, a leaking barn roof, and one aging tractor that stalled almost every time it crossed the field. The local bank manager listened politely before refusing another loan. The farm simply carried too much risk. Within days, neighbors began stopping by. Some offered sympathy. Others offered advice. Most suggested exactly the same thing. Sell before you lose everything. Among them was Dale Harper, a 62-year-old neighboring farmer whose family owned thousands of acres across Butler County. Tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly combed silver hair and deep wrinkles carved by decades beneath the prairie sun, Dale had built a reputation as both a successful businessman and a practical man who rarely allowed emotions to influence decisions. He genuinely believed he was helping. "You're a good kid, Emma," he said gently while leaning against his pickup truck. "But farming isn't about hope anymore. Sometimes walking away is the smartest thing you can do." Emma thanked him. She never argued. Yet every time someone suggested selling the land, she imagined her grandfather quietly watching from the old porch, unable to understand why 3 generations of memories could be measured only by dollars. A week later, she began cleaning the farmhouse room by room. Dust covered nearly everything. Inside William's bedroom, she discovered an old cedar chest tucked beneath the bed. Folded shirts, faded family photographs, military medals earned by her great-grandfather, and dozens of weather journals filled its contents. At the very bottom rested a worn leather notebook unlike the others. Across its first page, William had written only one sentence: "The land is always speaking. Most people simply stop listening." Emma read every page that evening. Some entries described rainfall. Others recorded soil conditions, insects, birds, and grazing patterns. The final pages became increasingly personal. William admitted he feared modern farming had begun treating land like a machine instead of something alive. When Emma reached the last page, she found only a single handwritten sentence. If one day the land stops breathing, listen to the chickens. She read it twice, then a third time. It made no sense. Her grandfather had never raised more than a dozen hens. Why would his final advice mention chickens instead of tractors, seeds, or rain? For the next several days, the question refused to leave her mind. Meanwhile, another repair bill arrived for the old tractor. The mechanic quietly shook his head. It's time to let her go. Emma stood in silence beside the faded green machine that had carried 3 generations through countless harvests. Selling it felt almost like saying goodbye to another member of her family. But 2 days later, the tractor was gone. Instead of purchasing newer equipment, as everyone expected, Emma drove nearly 70 miles to a poultry farm outside Wichita. By sunset, she returned home with 200 young Rhode Island red hens filling a livestock trailer. The following morning, the entire town seemed to know. People gathered outside the feed store exchanging confused looks. Some laughed openly. Others simply shook their heads. The poor girl has finally lost it. Emma heard every word. She climbed into the empty pasture, opened the trailer gate, and quietly watched 200 curious chickens scatter across the tired Kansas soil. She still had no idea what her grandfather's final message truly meant. But for the first time since his funeral, she felt something unexpected. Not certainty, just enough hope to keep going. The first days of summer arrived beneath a cloudless Kansas sky. Hot prairie winds swept across Butler County, lifting fine dust above fields already showing the strain of another dry season, while the morning sun cast long shadows across the Brooks farm. By sunrise each morning, Emma Brooks was already outside. Instead of repairing the old machinery she no longer owned, she focused on the 200 Rhode Island red hens that now wandered across the farm. The neighbors expected her to build one enormous chicken house. She did exactly the opposite. Using discarded fencing panels, salvaged wagon wheels, scrap lumber, and lightweight metal frames she found around the property, Emma spent nearly 2 weeks building a series of simple mobile chicken coops. Every Sunday afternoon, she hitched the coops to an old utility trailer and slowly pulled them to a different section of the cornfield. Each Monday morning, the chickens stepped onto fresh ground they had never explored before. At first, the routine looked absurd. The hens scattered eagerly through the rows of struggling corn, scratching constantly beneath the dry leaves. They devoured grasshoppers before the insects could chew young stalks. They hunted beetles hidden beneath fallen husks. Every claw loosened the hardened surface of the soil, while every step mixed natural fertilizer back into ground that had grown lifeless after years of chemical dependence and drought. Emma watched quietly, remembering the final sentence in her grandfather's journal. She still did not fully understand his meaning, but every evening she filled another notebook with careful observations, recording where the chickens grazed, how many insects they consumed, and which patches of soil became softer after only a few days. Several passing drivers slowed their trucks simply to watch. Most laughed. Some rolled down their windows to take photographs. Within a week, the Brooks farm had become the newest source of entertainment in Butler County. One afternoon, a pickup stopped beside the road. Out stepped Tyler Benson, a 26-year-old local social media creator whose online videos focused on unusual rural stories. Tall and lean with sandy blonde hair tucked beneath a backward baseball cap, Tyler wore sunglasses almost constantly and carried an expensive camera wherever he traveled. Friendly enough in person, but always chasing the next viral clip, he believed the internet rewarded the strangest stories more than the most meaningful ones. He filmed Emma quietly moving another chicken coop across the field. Then he zoomed in on hundreds of hens spreading between the rows of corn. Smiling toward the camera, he laughed. "I think we've officially found the craziest farmer in Kansas." The video appeared online that evening beneath the title, "The Girl Who Thinks Chickens Can Replace a Tractor." Within days, thousands of people watched it. Some joked that Emma should replace combines with ducks next. Others predicted the farm would be bankrupt before autumn. Emma saw every comment. For a few painful minutes, she wondered whether everyone else might be right. Late that evening, she walked back into William's old study, opened the weathered leather journal, and reread the final page. If one day the land stops breathing, listen to the chickens. She gently closed the book, Her grandfather had never wasted words. If he had written that sentence after 50 years of farming, there had to be a reason. The following weekend, another visitor arrived. This time it was Emma's uncle, Robert Brooks, William's younger brother. At 65, Robert was shorter than William had been, but equally weathered by decades beneath the Kansas sun. Thick gray hair curled beneath an old straw hat, and a heavy gray mustache framed a face lined by both laughter and disappointment. After selling his own farm years earlier following several difficult harvests, Robert had become convinced that modern farming belonged only to those with the newest machinery and the deepest pockets. Although he genuinely loved his niece, losing his own land had quietly replaced optimism with caution. He watched the chickens wandering freely through the corn for several long minutes. Finally, he sighed. "Emma." She looked up from repairing another movable fence. "You're burying your grandfather's farm." His words hurt more than the laughter online. Robert had known William his entire life. If even he believed the farm had no future, perhaps everyone else truly saw something she could not. Emma looked across the pasture where the chickens scratched patiently beneath the fading sunlight. The scene looked chaotic to everyone else. To her, it looked strangely purposeful. "I don't know exactly what Grandpa meant," she answered softly. "But I know he never wrote anything without a reason." Robert wanted to argue. Instead, he quietly removed his hat, glanced once toward William's empty farmhouse, and walked back to his truck without another word. As the evening wind drifted across the cornfield, Emma guided the final mobile coop into its new position for the coming week. The entire county believed she was destroying the Brooks farm one chicken at a time. She simply believed she had not yet reached the part of her grandfather's lesson that would finally make sense. Chapter 3. By mid-July, the hottest summer Butler County had experienced in more than 3 decades settled across the Kansas prairie. Day after day, a cloudless sky stretched endlessly above fields that seemed to surrender a little more with each passing afternoon. Hot winds carried fine dust across the roads instead of moisture, and the smell of dry earth lingered in the air long after sunset. The drought arrived with a cruelty few people had imagined possible. Cornfields throughout the county began turning pale weeks before harvest. Deep cracks split the hardened ground wide enough to swallow a man's boot. Grasshoppers multiplied in enormous swarms, stripping tender leaves from already weakened crops, while weeds somehow continued spreading despite the lack of rain, competing with corn for every remaining drop of water. Farmers who had once laughed at Emma Brooks now stood silently beside their own fields, watching entire seasons of work disappear beneath relentless heat. Every morning, Emma expected the Brooks farm to look just as hopeless. Yet somehow it didn't. The corn still showed signs of stress, but long ribbons of green continued stretching across much of the property, while neighboring farms faded into yellow and brown. The soil beneath her boots remained surprisingly loose instead of forming the rock-hard crust she saw elsewhere. Whenever she gently dug beneath the surface, cool moisture could still be felt several inches underground. She didn't understand why. She simply continued moving the mobile chicken coops exactly as she had every week since spring. The hens scratched tirelessly through the fields, chasing insects, turning over the soil, and spreading natural fertilizer with every step. Emma never imagined they were doing anything extraordinary. She believed she was simply following her grandfather's final advice. One afternoon, another pickup truck rolled slowly onto the property. Unlike the curious visitors who came only to laugh, this visitor stepped out carrying a weathered leather field bag, several soil sampling tubes, and a notebook already filled with handwritten observations. His name was Professor Daniel Mercer, a 58-year-old soil ecologist from the University of Kansas. Tall and slender with silver hair beginning to curl around his ears, Daniel wore wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped lower on his nose whenever he became absorbed in research. Years spent working beneath open skies had left his fair skin deeply tanned, while thoughtful gray eyes revealed endless curiosity rather than arrogance. His students admired him because he never believed science belonged only inside universities. Having grown up on a struggling wheat farm himself before becoming a researcher, he respected farmers as partners rather than subjects. He smiled politely as he approached Emma. "I hope you don't mind an unexpected visitor." Emma recognized neither his name nor the university logo stitched onto his faded field jacket. "I've seen enough unexpected visitors this summer," she answered with a tired smile. Daniel laughed softly. I came because of the video. Emma lowered her eyes. The one where everyone called me crazy? The very same. He paused. But I wasn't interested in the chickens. Emma looked surprised. I was interested in your soil. With her permission, Daniel spent the next several hours collecting samples from different parts of the farm. He measured moisture, examined roots, counted insects, and carefully turned over small sections of earth with a narrow spade. The deeper he looked, the quieter he became. Finally, he knelt beside one section where the chickens had grazed only days earlier. He gently lifted a handful of dark soil. It crumbled easily between his fingers. Moments later, he uncovered several large earthworms moving beneath the surface. Daniel smiled. Then he walked across the road to a neighboring field. There the soil was completely different. The ground had hardened into dense layers that resisted even his shovel. Earthworms were almost impossible to find. Dry weeds spread across the surface, while grasshopper damage covered much of the remaining corn. Returning to Emma's farm, Daniel compared both samples side by side. I don't think you realize what you've done. Emma looked genuinely confused. I haven't done anything special. You have. He pointed toward the chickens, quietly searching for insects between the corn rows. They've reduced pest pressure naturally. He pointed toward the loose soil. They've increased organic matter. Then he squeezed another handful of earth. And because this soil now contains more organic material, it holds significantly more water than the neighboring farms. Emma listened without speaking. Daniel opened his notebook. What you're doing is remarkably similar to regenerative farming. She frowned. I've never heard that term before. I believe you. So how did I learn it? Emma slowly reached into her shirt pocket and unfolded the weathered page she always carried from her grandfather's journal. She handed it to him. Daniel silently read the final sentence. If one day the land stops breathing, listen to the chickens. For several long moments, he simply stared at the paper. Then he looked across the pasture where 200 hens continued scratching peacefully beneath the summer sun. This, he whispered, wasn't an accident. Emma carefully folded the page again. No. A gentle smile appeared on her face. It was Grandpa teaching me, one last time. Autumn arrived beneath clear blue skies as cool winds replaced the relentless heat that had punished Butler County for months. Golden sunlight spread across the prairie each morning, revealing a landscape divided by one unmistakable difference. Beyond Emma Brooks' fence, countless cornfields stood thin, brittle, and prematurely brown. Inside the Brooks farm, long rows of healthy ears still swayed gently above dark, living soil. Harvest season began with heavy hearts throughout the county. Combines rolled slowly across neighboring farms, but their grain tanks filled far more slowly than anyone remembered. Many families harvested barely half of what they normally expected. Some fields produced so little that farmers shut down their machines before finishing, unwilling to waste expensive diesel fuel gathering crops that would never cover the cost of planting them. Emma woke before sunrise on the first day of harvest. Standing beside the weathered grain wagon her grandfather had used for decades, she closed her eyes for a brief moment before whispering a quiet prayer. She wasn't asking for abundance anymore. She only hoped the land had survived. When the first rows of corn entered the combine borrowed from a neighboring farmer, she watched nervously as golden kernels poured steadily into the grain tank. Hour after hour, the harvest continued. The numbers surprised everyone. The Brooks farm had produced almost the same yield it had during years blessed with normal rainfall. Professor Daniel Mercer stood quietly at the edge of the field, comparing moisture records with his notebook. Even as a scientist, he struggled to hide his amazement. The difference was no longer a theory buried inside soil samples. It could now be measured in truckloads of grain. The surprises did not end there. Emma carefully reviewed her farm ledger that evening. Because the chickens had naturally fertilized the fields throughout the growing season, she had purchased almost no commercial fertilizer. Since the hens had consumed grasshoppers, beetles, and many destructive insects before they multiplied, pesticide expenses had been nearly eliminated as well. Meanwhile, egg sales at the local farmers market had continued every single week, providing dependable income while neighboring farms waited months for harvest. For the first time since William Brooks passed away, Emma realized the farm had generated steady cash flow instead of relying on a single annual crop. The following week, something even more unexpected happened. Pickup trucks began appearing outside the Brooks farm before breakfast. This time no one came to laugh. Men and women who had once mocked her stopped quietly beside the pasture carrying spiral notebooks instead of folded arms. Among them stood Dale Harper. The proud farmer removed his weathered hat before speaking. "I owe you an apology." Emma smiled gently. "You don't owe me anything." I laughed. So did everyone else. Dale looked across the field where the chickens scratched peacefully beneath harvested corn stalks. "I thought you were destroying your grandfather's farm." Emma followed his gaze. "So did I, for a little while." More visitors arrived throughout the morning. Young farmers, retired ranchers, families hoping to save land that had belonged to them for generations. They asked the same question again and again. "Can you teach us?" Emma led them into William's old farmhouse instead of the fields. Inside the living room stood the weathered leather journal that had changed everything. She placed it carefully on the wooden table. "I don't have a secret formula," she said softly. "I only have this." The room fell silent. Professor Mercer watched from the doorway as Emma carefully explained how she had simply trusted her grandfather's observations without fully understanding the science behind them. Several visitors asked whether she planned to publish a book or sell training courses. Others suggested patenting the method before large agricultural companies copied it. Emma quietly shook her head. During the following weeks, she spent every evening scanning William Brooks' journals page by page. With Professor Mercer's help, hundreds of copies were printed and distributed free of charge to anyone who wanted one. At the final workshop before winter, Emma handed the last journal to a young farmer whose family was struggling to keep their land. He reached for his wallet. Emma gently pushed it back. "No." He looked confused. "I can't accept this for free." Emma smiled, remembering the quiet man who had filled every page with hope long before she understood its value. She looked around the room filled with neighbors who had once doubted her, but now genuinely wanted to learn. Then she spoke the words that would soon spread far beyond Butler County. "Knowledge only stays alive when it's shared." No one applauded. No one needed to. Every person in that room already understood that the greatest harvest Emma Brooks had gathered that autumn could never be measured inside a grain bin. 3 springs had passed since the day Emma Brooks opened the trailer and released 200 curious hens on a soil that everyone else believed was beyond saving. Gentle April rain once again drifted across Butler County, soaking fields that looked very different from those of 3 years before. The prairie carried shades of green that many longtime farmers had almost forgotten existed, and wherever the wind crossed healthy grasslands, the earth no longer rose into clouds of dust. Instead, it held together, rich with life that had slowly returned beneath the surface. The Brooks farm had changed as well. The weathered farmhouse still stood exactly where William Brooks had built his life, but laughter now replaced silence. The old machine shed had been transformed into a classroom, where farmers gathered every month to exchange ideas instead of competing over secrets. Mobile chicken coops rested near thriving pastures, and visitors often smiled when they realized that the famous flock looked surprisingly ordinary. There was nothing magical about the birds themselves. The miracle had always been the patience behind the way they were managed. Professor Daniel Mercer kept his promise. Working alongside the University of Kansas and several agricultural organizations, he helped establish the William Brooks Soil Research Center directly on the family farm. The modest building blended naturally into the landscape, constructed from reclaimed wood and local stone, so it looked more like an old prairie barn than a modern laboratory. Students, researchers, and farmers worked side by side every season, comparing scientific data with practical experience, exactly as William would have wanted. The greatest success, however, could not be measured inside laboratories. Across Kansas, more than 200 struggling farms had adopted Emma's rotational grazing system. Some copied it exactly. Others adapted it to their own land and livestock. Every farm looked different, yet they shared the same philosophy. Take care of the soil first. Everything else follows. Many families who had prepared to auction land that had belonged to their grandparents instead harvested another season. Young farmers who had nearly abandoned agriculture chose to stay. Even neighboring counties once known for severe erosion slowly began reporting healthier fields and improved water retention after applying the same principles. One warm afternoon, Emma stood outside the research center watching a group of children follow Noah Harper, a 14-year-old boy whose parents had nearly lost their ranch before adopting William's methods. With dark brown hair, bright blue eyes, and endless curiosity, Noah eagerly explained the difference between living soil and exhausted ground while holding handfuls of earth for younger children to examine. Listening nearby, Emma realized the greatest lesson was no longer being taught by her. It had begun teaching itself. Late that day, a television reporter interviewing visiting farmers eventually asked the question Emma had heard hundreds of times. If you could go back, the reporter said, would you still sell your grandfather's last tractor to buy 200 chickens? Emma looked across the pasture where another generation of hens quietly searched beneath fresh grass. She smiled. Without hesitation, the reporter waited for a longer explanation. Emma simply pointed toward the fields surrounding them. I thought Grandpa left me an old tractor. She paused. But he never did. He left me faith. The tractor could only work the land. His wisdom taught the land how to heal itself. Near the entrance to the farm stood a large wooden sign that visitors often stopped to photograph before leaving. Hand-carved by local craftsmen, it carried the words, "Healthy soil feeds every generation." As evening settled across Butler County, families loaded pickup trucks after another community workshop. Researchers packed away notebooks. Children laughed while chasing chickens through fresh spring grass. Older farmers who once doubted Emma now shook her hand with genuine gratitude before driving home to care for their own recovering fields. Years earlier, the town remembered Emma Brooks as the young woman who sold her last tractor to buy chickens. Now almost nobody mentioned the tractor. Instead, people remembered something much greater. They remembered the young farmer who listened when everyone else laughed. And because she listened, an entire valley learned that the richest harvest is not measured by what we take from the land, but by what we restore for those who come after us. Sometimes, God's greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or lightning. Sometimes, they begin with one quiet act of faith that everyone else laughs at. Emma believed in the wisdom her grandfather left behind, and through patience, humility, and trust, God turned a forgotten idea into hope for countless families. In our own lives, we may not all be farmers, but we all plant something every day: kindness, faith, encouragement, or love. Never underestimate the small seeds God places in your hands. One faithful choice today may become someone else's miracle tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe faith, kindness, and second chances can still change lives, please subscribe and join our community. May God bless you, your family, and every heart that chooses to plant hope for the next generation.